might think, well, why bother with this strange old book at all? And that's a good question, you know. It's a contradictory document that's been cobbled together over thousands of years. It's outlasted kingdoms, many, many kingdoms. You know, it's really interesting that it turns out that a book is more durable than stone. It's more durable than a castle. It's more durable than an empire. And that's really interesting, you know, that something in some sense so evanescent can be so long-living. So there's that. That's kind of a mystery. I'm approaching this whole scenario, the biblical stories, as if they're a mystery, fundamentally, because they are. There's a lot we don't understand about them. We don't understand how they came about. We don't really understand how they were put together. We don't understand why they had such an unbelievable impact on civilization. We don't understand how people could have believed them. We don't understand what it means that we don't believe them now, or even what it would mean if we did believe them. And then, on top of all that, there's the additional problem, which isn't specific to me, but is certainly relevant to me, that no matter how educated you are, you're not educated enough to discuss the psychological significance of the biblical stories. But I'm going to do my best, and partly because I want to learn more about them. And one of the things I've learned is that the best way to learn about something is to talk about it. And when I'm lecturing, I'm thinking, you know, I'm not trying to tell you what I know for sure to be the case, because there's lots of things I don't know for sure to be the case. See, one of the things that bothers me about simple-minded atheism, and I would say the simple-minded atheism is of the sort that regards these stories as nothing but simple superstitions, is that it's very, very poorly informed. Because whatever these stories are, they are not merely simple superstitions. They weren't conjured up by some cabal of priests to bamboozle the masses, even though they were used for that purposes from time to time. It's much, much more complicated than that. They have a very ancient lineage, and they're tied together with all sorts of other stories. And there's an emergent wisdom in them. And I think the right way to view them is as the birthplace of sophisticated philosophical ideas. And so you have to wrestle with these stories. You can't just... And I said already that I'm going to be as rational as I possibly can in my discussion of these stories, and not refer to anything metaphysical except when that's absolutely necessary, even though I don't want to eliminate the possibility of a metaphysical reality, because I think that's premature. But you have to take the stories seriously if you're going to approach the problem properly. You can't just casually dismiss them. It's not appropriate. So I'm going to reiterate this. You know, I've learned something. I have this idea that it would be a good idea for young people and older people, citizens of the West, let's say, to learn more about their culture and their civilization, right? Because it's a great civilization, and it's taken a lot of work to put together. But I don't think that we really know. I mean, I know a fair bit about it, although I wouldn't consider myself nearly as educated as a person should be. But I'm not too badly educated. But I tell you, going through these biblical lectures, verse by verse, just makes me even more aware of how unbelievably ignorant I am. You know, and partly for two reasons. Like, one is because I've been using this BibleHub.com place, and I think I told you last week, but I wanted to reiterate it because it's important. It's so interesting the way that they've set it up, because you can go through the biblical stories verse by verse, and then for each verse there's a whole small font page of commentary from multiple sources. And so, you know, not only is the Bible hyperlinked in the way that I discussed in the first lecture, with all the verses referring to not all the other verses, but lots of them, but it's got its tendrils out into literature, you know, direct commentaries on the text, but also all the literature that's been influenced by it. So it's an unbelievably central and core text. And it's so interesting to read a book where every sentence has been commented on, well, really in volumes, and then just to get a sense of that volume of material, you know, how much power, brain power there's been put into this. And to also understand how bloody ignorant like, I'm so ignorant about this. There's all this work, and it seems that we've left it to decay in the dust, and it's a big mistake, man. It's a big mistake, because the people who are writing these commentaries, like, you know, a lot of it's from the 14th and 15th and 16th century. It's kind of archaic, and it's some of it's outdated, and some of it you wouldn't agree with. But if you read all the commentaries side by side, you know, you get a pretty good blast of wisdom coming at you. And like, the thing about wisdom is it stops you from running face first into walls, you know. It's not just there so that you can talk to people at parties about what university you graduated from, you know. And it's there because the information is unbelievably useful. And, you know, one of the things that you do with your ideal, let's say, is you establish a contract with it. And you also establish like a social contract with other people, right? That's what keeps society organized. And so there's this idea that emerges in the Abraham stories of a sacred contract, and that has the same function as the ark. And what it does, because what happens in Abraham, and we'll see more of this today, is that he, you know, God tells him to go forward into the world, and we talked about that last week, and he does that, and he encounters famine, and he encounters tyranny, and he encounters powerful people who want to take from him what is his. I mean, God sends him out in the world, but it's not like he has an easy ride of it. It isn't easy at all. It's as hard as it can be. But there's this consistent emphasis in the text, and I think it's something really worth attending to, that if you maintain your contract, and that has to do with honesty and trust and truth and all of those things, if you maintain your contract, then you have a good possibility, the best possible possibility of making your way through the catastrophe and the chaos. And I don't want to be naive about this. You know, when I read Jung and I started to understand the idea of the hero archetype, you know, the idea that the human being is a force, a logos force that can stand up against chaos and catastrophe and tragedy and evil and prevail. I never did think that meant that if you did stand up and tell the truth, that you would necessarily prevail, right? It's not a magic trick. It's your best bet. That's the thing. You don't have a better option. And see, the idea is emerging in the Abrahamic text. It's like people are figuring this out. That would be progressive revelation. That's one way of thinking about it. And you can think about that in religious terms, but you can also think about it as humanity consulting itself, right? Each individual talking to themselves, which is what we do when we think, and each individual communicating with every other individual and gathering a body of wisdom that helps people orient themselves in the toughest conditions. And it's an incremental process, and I really do believe that that's speaking purely secularly. I do believe that that's what manifests itself in the biblical stories, right? It's the dawning enlightenment of mankind, something like that, as we start to understand the principles by which we have to live in order to orient ourselves properly in the world. So, and I also do believe, and this is the thing that's the unspoken question, is like, you don't have any idea how rich and fulfilling your life could be despite its tragedy and limitation if you stop doing the things that you know to be wrong. It's a really grand experiment. And you know, one of the things that God tells Abraham constantly as the story progresses, especially every time Abraham makes a sacrifice, is God says, walk with me and be perfect. It's something like that. And so the injunction is, well, aim high, establish this relationship with the highest thing that you can conceive of, which you might as well do that, because, well, what are you going to do? Establish a relationship with the most mediocre thing you can conceive of? Or you're going to establish a relationship with the lowest thing you can conceive of? People do that, and I wouldn't recommend it. It's a really bad thing, and there's a lot of pain associated with that, and maybe, you know, there's pain that can expand into a world-destroying force down that route, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. So is there something superstitious and foolish about attempting to establish a contractual relationship with the source of all being? I mean, I just don't see that as an erroneous conception. Culture is a structure of category that we all share. So we see things the same way. Well, that's why we can talk. I mean, not exactly the same way, because then we'd have nothing to talk about. But roughly speaking, we have a bedrock of agreement. That's the Bible, by the way. So I just walked through the Museum of the Bible in Washington. That was very cool. It's a very cool museum.
So the structure, that's what the Bible
Yeah, it's what
provides.
I figured out. I just figured this out this week. So it was a cool thing to walk through because it's chronological. They have one floor which is the history of the Bible. But it's not exactly that. It's really what it is the history of the book. Now, in many ways, the first book was the Bible. I mean, literally, because at one point there was only one book. Like, as far as our Western culture is concerned, there was one book. And for a while, literally, there was only one book. And that book was the Bible. And then before it was the Bible, it was, it was scrolls and it was writings on papyrus. But we were starting to aggregate written text together. And it went through all sorts of technological transformations, and then it became books that everybody could buy, the book everybody could buy, and the first one of those was the Bible. And then it became all sorts of books that everybody could buy. But all those books, in some sense, emerged out of that underlying book. And that book itself, the Bible isn't a book, it's a library. It's a collection of books. And so, what I figured out was, partly because I was talking to my brother-in-law, Jim Keller, who's the world's greatest chip designer and has now designed a chip that's as powerful as the human brain, which is optimized for artificial intelligence learning, by the way. So, in any case, we were talking about meaning in text because we were talking about translation and the problem of understanding text. And Jim said, the meaning of words is coded in the relationship of the words to one another. And the postmodernists make that case, that all meaning is derived from the relationship between words. That's wrong, because, well, what about rage? That's not words. And what about moving your hand? That's not words. So it's wrong, but part of it's right, because the meaning we derive from the verbal domain is encoded in the relationship between words. So now then you think, well, let's think about the relationship between words. Well, some words are dependent on other words. Some ideas are dependent on other ideas. The more ideas are dependent on a given idea, the more fundamental that idea is. That's a definition of fundamental. So now imagine you have an aggregation of texts in a civilization. You say, which are the fundamental texts? And the answer is, the texts upon which most other texts depend. And so you'd put Shakespeare way in there in English, because so many texts are dependent on Shakespeare's literary revelations. And Milton would be in that category, and Dante would be in that category, at least in translation. Fundamental authors, part of the Western canon, not because of the arbitrary dictates of power, but because those texts influenced more other texts. And then you think about that as a hierarchy, okay, with the Bible at its base, which is certainly the case. Now imagine that's the entire corpus of linguistic production, all things considered. Now, how do you understand that? Like, literally, how do you understand that? The answer is, you sample it by reading and listening to stories and listening to people talk. You sample that whole domain. You build a low-resolution representation of that inside you, and then you listen and see through that. And so it isn't that the Bible is true. It's that the Bible is the precondition for the manifestation of truth, which makes it way more true than just true. It's a whole different kind of true. And I think this is not only literally the case, factually, I think it can't be any other way. It's the only way we can solve the problem of perception. But I mean, one of the reasons that I think the New Testament is psychologically true, let's say, is because, and this is one of the things that's deeply embedded in the structure of the Bible. In the Old Testament, there's this idea, and I'm skipping ahead, that through a succession of states, the people who behave properly will eventually establish the proper state. And so the state is viewed in some sense as the entity of salvation. But what happens in the New Testament is that idea gets, you could say, deconstructed. And instead of a state being the place of redemption, a state of being becomes the state of redemption. And so the idea that human beings will be redeemed moves from the utopian state vision to the responsibility of the individual. And I think that's correct. I mean, I believe that that's the right answer. And I think that the West in particular is predicated on that idea because it makes the state subservient to the individual. I mean, there's There's a what? A dialogue, a continual dialogue. But in the final analysis, the locus of the divine is the individual, not the state. And I believe that that's so true that if we don't act it out and believe it, then we all die painfully. And that's true enough for me. The reason you need profound things, as far as I can tell, you need profound knowledge, is because life is actually a profound problem for everyone. I mean, you can shelter back and live a very conservative existence, and look, like, more power to you. I understand why you would do that, but it doesn't stop you from having to face the ultimate questions of life. They're right there in everyone's face, and at least at some point in your life. And it would be better if you could, I think, if you could confront them full on, and to deal with them properly, and to be a beacon of strength as a consequence of that. And I think that wisdom, that's what the humanities are supposed to teach, is wisdom. And wisdom is what enables you to deal honorably with the tragedy of life. And I think I can't see how you could think that that was a bad idea, because there are going to be times when you're in an emergency room and, prone to panic and to cry and to break down and to collapse and to be of no use to anyone around you. And that's not the right way to be. It's the right way to be in a situation like that is to be strong and reliable, and I don't think you can do that without being wise. And you can't be wise without putting yourself together and without knowing something about where you came from and what you're like, and that's history and the humanities. And so this isn't optional. It's more necessary. The man does not live by bread alone, and that's exactly the issue here. What I've been thinking about for a long time is I can't tell if I'm like an advocate of the religious viewpoint or its worst possible critic, because I am doing my best to make it rational, and there's a reductionistic element to that, but I think that I'm doing that while also leaving the door open to things that I don't understand, because I know that there's more to this story than I understand or can understand, and I'm laying out what I can understand and I'm making it rational, but I do not believe for an instant that exhausts the realm. It's like there are ways of interpreting these stories that work in the conceptual universe we inhabit right now. But there's a lot of things that we don't understand. And one thing I've found about digging into these stories is that the deeper you dig, the more you find. And that's that's one of the things that convinced me that there was more to them than I had originally suspected, because things would click and I'd think, wow, that's really something. And then I would take it apart further and I'd think, oh, well, I thought that was something, but this is even more remarkable. It just keeps opening and opening.